Thank you, Carol, again for your kind introduction. This topic that I chose is pan-securitization and the impact on development. And by pan-securitization, I wasn't thinking about turning assets into securities. I was really thinking about the national security first policy, which seems to be adopted by many countries, And national security is my favorite subject, as you all know. And Hong Kong, we just managed to enact our Article 23 legislation, really as part of our defensive mechanism. Since its commencement on 23rd March, I think everybody will have noticed there has been no wave of arrests, It's really to complete our legislation to bolster national security, And in fact, we are all very relaxed that we have completed our constitutional and legal duty toward our country. But unfortunately, we were hit by news yesterday that 3 Hong Kong residents in London were arrested for spying or getting access to protected information or assisting a foreign agency. This is very troubling, but this is part of a trend of every country privileging national security. So I want to put my first question to Kurt. In the old days, U.S. was perceived as a great friend and supporter of China. During World War II, you helped us to fight the Japanese, and you helped China accession to the WTO. U.S. has always supported Hong Kong's free trade regime, a big trade and investment partner. But there seems to have been a sea change in your policy. I came across a report by 2 former ambassadors to India, to report. Don't know whether you have seen it, It's a report to the Council on Foreign Relations. It's quite interesting. Revising U.S. grand strategy toward China from a policy of engagement, integration into the world economy, into a policy of containment and stepping up of export control, sanctions, etc., which is perceived by China as, toughening the containment of China, keeping China down. Why has this happened? China is only a middle-income country. Its per capita GDP is about 12, 13K US, middle income. US is what? 84,000 per capita, We have many problems, demographics, slowing economy, all that. Why does the US have to adopt such a radical change of policy to identify China as the #1 national security threat?
Well, thank you, Regina. And first, I just want to say thanks for having me today at this event. And I think all of the effort and time that has been put into organizing this summit is very laudatory, and just really excited to be part of what will hopefully be a series of really meaningful engagements between thought leaders from a variety of countries in Hong Kong to talk about the problems that you're raising. I'm going to put on my I work for a company called the Asia Group. We provide advice to private corporations, but I'm going to put on my Georgetown University professor hat, because we actually have 2 units devoted to this very question that you just raised. And it is a complicated question, because there are theoretical writings. Graham Allison's book about the Thucydides trap is, of course, the most popular one, that share this notion that a status quo power, in this case the United States, and a rising power, in this case China, are inevitably destined for conflict, and perhaps even outright conflict in the form of war. But then Allison, in his own book, challenges that notion and points out to many examples where that has been avoided, and not only avoided, but that the relationship has changed in a way that becomes very cooperative. So one of the things that I think about on this topic, and sorry to go on too long, but just want to frame it for you, is that the post-World War II rise of Japan and Germany in particular economically was perceived in the United States as a threat. And I grew up and was trained in the days when the primary challenge to the US economically and technologically was considered to be Japan and secondarily Germany. And the reaction to that was protectionist in nature. Like we're seeing now in the United States, that there will be tariffs announced tomorrow, which are part protectionism and part kind of technology strategy in terms of their design. And the drift towards protectionism in the United States was profound at that time, but as it is now, but it's subsided over time. And I think that the difference is that for geopolitical reasons, the United States and China have found themselves on opposite sides of many issues. The most prominent one recently is the Russia's invasion of Ukraine and China's continuing support of Russia despite that invasion. But there are other examples of geopolitical differences of opinion or standoffs between the US and China. And so I actually have two answers to the question. One is that with that geopolitical framing, China's economic rise becomes viewed more as a threat than an opportunity over time in the United States. Now, the US is trying not to say the word containment. They're saying the word competition. From China's perspective, it feels like containment. And there's a little bit of kind of sophistry around the terminology there. But that is a fundamental fact that the geopolitics is driving some of the reaction. And the other reason that I find is profound is that the nature of China's economic structure, with a heavy degree of reliance on state-owned enterprises and state-directed capital, and still to this day suppressed domestic demand and household demand, which is well documented and discussed by the IMF and everybody else, that is also leading to a feeling of overconcentration of manufacturing capability in China compared to the rest of the world, and that's also viewed as a threat from the United States. So it's a combination of that geopolitical pressure or threat or perceived threat, and then the nature of China's what is capitalism with Chinese characteristics or socialist approach to economic development that is leading to the friction that we're seeing now. So my hope is that this will be well understood by everyone and solutions can be found to diffuse the various problems, and also that perhaps most importantly for China's long-term development as well as its smooth economic relations with other countries, that the pace of economic reform within China resumes and China continues to move in the direction of a more market-oriented economy. So sorry to give you a long discourse, but it was a very complex question.
Thank you, Kurt. Before I turn to Professor Huang, maybe I could just respond very quickly to your comments, shared by many columnists that China should encourage its people to spend more, to use consumption to boost growth. I think it's not just state policy, it's partly cultural. Chinese people like to save, Historically, we always have a high level of savings. They like to buy homes, And you may have heard mainland Chinese tourists in Hong Kong, they're spending far more abstemiously than before. Generally speaking, Chinese culture on the mainland is more austere, more stoic than Western societies. So there's also a cultural factor other than state policy. But now I'd like to turn to Professor Huang. Well, what do you think of the Western view of China as a national security threat, you know? What should we do to mitigate such anxiety?
Thank you. Thank you, Lady Lau. Also, thanks to the Ambassador. It's also my great pleasure to be invited for this panel in particular. As our previous session has discussed about the globalization, deglobalization, or even anti-globalization, at least for market, for economy, for prosperity, development, etc., either we use the term globalization or connectivity, sharing the opportunities, etc., are the keys, rather than deglobalization, disconnection, or decoupling, or even the soft term de-risk. US was the key one to drive the previous or last globalization. Either we agree or not, there can be a globalization again or re-globalization, as Eric argues. But in terms of economic opportunities or sharing opportunities for prosperity for all, I think we should not emphasize so much on geopolitics, nor to politicize, even weaponize those originally such as trade, technology, etc. Of course, national security, either from a US point of view or from a Chinese point of view, for whoever's, are so crucial for even for development. So it's two sides of the one coin. Without national security, or you don't have the foundation. But on the other side, without development, prosperity, and connectivity, the so-called security would be very weak. So back to Ambassador's the 2 points, I think for the first, we should also recognize, as the previous session many speakers have emphasized, we have much more than just geopolitics nowadays. Demographic change, climate change, change or even challenges in terms of the global governance. All of these are the common issue and challenges to all of us. Whatever political, social differences we may still have. Second, I think even in terms of geopolitics, we do not have to have that kind of 18th century or 19th century's sort of narrative, say zero-sum game, yeah, or either or sort of binary approach, but rather see how even both geopolitics and geo-economies, as when U.S. Previous President Bill Clinton has emphasized, that's economy, if no more the only issue, but still the key issue for all of us. So even when you have mentioned the Ukraine war, actually I would argue if China has supported Russia, the result would have been very different nowadays. Second, in terms of competition, of course, market economy, global economy, or whatever we describe it, there has to be competition. But the competition does not necessarily mean a kind of consequence of zero-sum game. So from the Chinese, we have used the term competition, cooperation and competition. Even I can remember, Jiemian can correct me, even 30 years ago, in the early 1990s, we use a term when China was just beginning to get into that globalization, competition. So cooperation and the competition. That was kind of a constructive and healthier environment for all of us. So I would think for some US either people in the national strategy, national security circles, when they see China, they have more sort of perceptions than realities. Kind of narrative first, then see China can be next, even much bigger, stronger challenger. As you mentioned, Japan, Germany, when their economies was getting stronger. This was not necessarily the case. And as Lady Lau has just emphasized, also quite crucial, I think, is the cultural differences. And for China, still one of the few nowadays which now is, say, globalization is such a good opportunity, not only for Chinese, but for all of us. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Professor Wang. I think your points are that the China threat is really overplayed, you know. The perception of the China threat is overplayed. And despite the geopolitical perceptions, there's a lot we could do in common. You know, you mentioned climate change. We can work together on climate change. And the two countries are working together. And also on governance of AI, right, you know. What else can we work together? You know, academic exchange, you know, more students studying in our respective countries. But I've heard a lot of complaints about Chinese students issue with student visas and even PhD students halfway through their studies, stop at the airport and send back. That's very bad, you know. I'm sure that's not your government's policy, you know. So how do we promote more connectivity, as Professor Wang suggested?
Yeah, so at times I think the United States has crossed some elements. It's a large, diverse country, and there's a lot of agencies involved and a lot of policies. The U.S. has gotten too far forward in viewing a variety of aspects of China's rise as a threat, which are actually not a threat to the United States. I would put most student activities into that category. But conversely, I think that China has also become less welcoming to Americans and American students, as well as business people. So there is a perceptions situation of threat and counter-threat that leads to escalation and leads to a problem. So you can try to diffuse that through leader-level discussions, which has happened between President Biden and President Xi. That can have an impact for a while. You can try to do the joint project approach, like let's work together on climate change, let's work together on AI, let's work together on global health, and frankly, the US and China both failed miserably during COVID to cooperate when it was such an obvious need for the two countries to work together on the pandemic. Or you can just try to manage and muddle your way through while having a relationship that's primarily characterized at the government-to-government level by competition, but have it be in the private sector primarily focused on cooperation. And that, I think, is the goal of many, particularly private sector actors in the United States, to see a situation where, as Professor Huang is defining, you have some separation of the geopolitical frictions from doing business. The challenge comes when there's crossover between business activity, private sector activity, and government perceptions and government needs. Going back to the previous panel's discussion and raising of the issue of dual technology, one of the panelists said, every technology could be a dual technology. Well, if that's the case, then if you're suspecting the other side of making every item on the planet into a weapon, then there will be no more trade, right? So we do need to figure out the difference between goods which can and should be traded or invested freely and others which need to be protected for national security purposes. That's a really complicated exercise. I think what the Biden team's trying to do is do that while communicating its intentions and direction clearly to the Chinese side, and China is also doing it to some extent in return. That's being managed okay, I wouldn't say well, but okay at the current point. But it's a potential problem that doesn't have an easy solution to it going forward. The other problem I'd go back to is the underlying concern about the effects of globalization on the U.S. economy, and in particular, those effects when so much manufacturing capacity is being concentrated in China. And so, Regina, going back to your remarks about, Chinese like to save money, culturally, well, that's great, but then they also like to produce everything on the planet and use that savings to create low-cost, high-quality goods inside China in ways that other countries struggle to do, and then you end up with massive trade imbalances and international friction. So these problems need to get worked through, and I think that the most important thing is to understand them clearly, and rather than pointing fingers and doing sort of whataboutism conversations, to actually find fundamental solutions going forward. I've been very disappointed recently in the performance of the G20. It should be a key global forum for working through these problems and coming up with a consensus among major countries going beyond the US and China. We need to get back to doing that much better. The United Nations is kind of a broken mess, and the WTO is also fallen apart. A lot of that has to do with the United States, a lot of it has to do with China. So getting back to re-globalization, as the previous panel attempted to address, I think is going to be challenging, but it should be a shared objective with the understanding of what the challenges are, and not just dismissing those challenges as if they didn't exist.
Well, Kurt, you already highlighted many problems, how to ring-fence technologies or businesses so that they can be dealt with as businesses per se, not businesses or technologies that have defense implications and could pose threats to national security. Your national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, once said that he wants to keep a small yard with high fence. How is this coming along? From our part of the world, it looks like the yard is getting bigger and bigger. More and more entities being added to the sanctions list, and that will hurt US businesses as well. A lot of your tech companies have big business in China.
Yeah. This is for me. Sorry, Dr. Huang. Just quickly on that, I do think that the fence has a lot of holes in it, and the yard is getting bigger. That's my own impression. And the problem there is that in an atmosphere of distrust and overall sense of contentious competition, then politically the domestic push will be in the direction of making that yard bigger and bigger, beyond what U.S. private sector would like to see. So there's an active dialogue between American companies and the U.S. government about trying to keep that yard from becoming like a golf course. You want to be more like a little yard. And that is a challenging thing to do given the political pressures on the administration. And the question is whether there's good clarity of purpose if you're going to have a technology denial policy. Is that clearly defined, and you have clear KPIs for success? And I personally would like to see more clear objectives for that, so that it's a minimum. The minimum required technology denial activity takes place. Now, I'm in the private sector. People in Congress would say, well, we should have a maximalist approach to that. So it's a difficult issue, but it's something that in a government-to-government sense needs even more communication.
All three of us are in private sector, and this problem of lack of trust, and what can we do to build more trust, and communication? I'll start with you, Professor Huang.
Thank you again. I also share the observation that the yard is getting larger while the fence is higher. Therefore, in order to reduce risks, to also hopefully even gradually stabilize China-US relations, not only for the two countries, but also for the world. Four, at least, if not all, possibilities for keeping the communications, even cooperation, collaborations, are important. Youth, especially students, as you say, exchanges, local corporations, company, private. Actually, both Huawei and TikTok are private companies, not state, nor sort of anyhow. So company, and finally to those kind of, say, NGO or non-governmental agencies for keeping the ties, and hopefully then this can help the official ties, which we used to have more than 65 ministerial level regular communication between US and China. And then starting from Donald Trump's administration, firstly because of trade, then now expanded to technology, to education, even culture. So we should reestablish, therefore, in order to stabilize the relationship. Of course, in the meantime, US has its own national either security concerns or whatever interests. China the same. Well, whatever national concerns and security concerns, you need to also have much wider and deeper sort of outlook and see the main possibilities in order to avoid kind of either Cold War or whatever wars against each other.
So Kurt, do you see US-China relationship stabilizing right now? And what's your recommendations for, helping the relationships to stabilize or even improve, building more connectivity? What do you think of Professor Huang's 4 possibilities?
Well, I think things are more stable now than they were a couple years ago. And a lot of effort's been put into that by the the U.S. administration and the Chinese government. But I'm concerned about the impact of U.S. politics on that, which does drive things in the direction of destabilization. I'm concerned about China's impatience with respect to some of the geopolitical issues and that perhaps creating instability. So in that context, what I would like to see is a more vigorous amount of both communication and then also negotiation. So one of the things about the Biden administration is from the U.S. perspective, they've done a brilliant job of reinforcing American relations with other countries in Asia besides China, but the direct engagement has primarily been information sharing rather than negotiation. And it seems to me that there are areas where a little more direct give and take, trade-offs and agreements being reached, including in areas like climate change, which are usually described as cooperation, but it's actually, a lot of it is a question about who goes first and how much and at what cost, but also particularly in trade. So there is this discussion in Washington and I think also in Beijing about the possible impact of Donald Trump being reelected as president. He has stated on the campaign trail that he's very interested in the trade deficit and is excited about more tariffs and interested in focusing on the trade deficit as a key priority. So if that is the case, in order to accomplish that, one could see a negotiation approach, as was attempted in the first Trump administration, coming back. And if that happens, I hope to see the negotiation be more successful than last time. And I think it's a very challenging negotiation if there is an actual bilateral discussion like that. But I personally would like to see more give and take and actual outcomes-oriented discussion between the two governments rather than just a sharing of information. Even though there's risks, as happened in 2018, of the negotiations breaking down, I still think it's worth the try.
Well, before our time runs out, one final question for our two speakers, what can Hong Kong do? How can we contribute to easing the tensions, in the recent CSIS report published, we note that the US government confirms, in a way, Hong Kong is still important to the US. 13,000 companies, 1,300 companies making money in Hong Kong, 85,000 Americans, I think, living quite happily, We have long-standing ties with US as well. Of course, China is our motherland. China, US are our biggest trade and investment partner, and we know both pretty well. What can we do? What can Hong Kong, despite being a small city, what can we do to help ease tensions and stabilize relationship? Professor Huang?
Thank you. That's exactly, if I may add, apart from that, the four possibilities, the fifth would be the role of Hong Kong. But before this, I can very shortly also respond to the ambassador's suggestions. I think before US and China, at the governmental level, even highest level, the crisis management is the first. Second is to jointly identify the common challenges. If there are common challenges, there are common interests. Then how Hong Kong, because Hong Kong is so unique, I would think. On the one side, of course, since 1997, it has been also already a part of China. But on the other side, it's also has been and will be a so-called capitalist system and part of the world economy, in particular part of the Western economies. So it has such a, not only unique for China, but unique for the world. We don't have such a place anywhere else. So Hong Kong will bridge not only US, China, Western and the rest, the West and the rest, but also to help to narrow the problems, even possible confrontations, but rather to provide the platform for all business, small and big, and for also the four opportunities I mentioned can also always be maybe even the first taking place here. So Hong Kong is still the place I had such a hope, but actually the CSIS report, I was quite disappointed. They did not really see the good side or opportunities of Hong Kong, but rather identify some so-called problems here.
In the context of overall competitive thinking in Washington, I was very happy to see in that context the CSIS report actually holding out the idea that deeper engagement between the US and Hong Kong, including at the official level, would be beneficial to the United States as well as to Hong Kong. Because that thread of engagement between the US and Hong Kong, both official and private, has been lost in the last 5 years. And I, as someone who lived here for a short time and represented the United States, would really love to see that come back. And you spoke, Regina, about stabilization, and I posited that the current environment is one of relative stability compared to a few years ago. That puts the ball in Hong Kong's court. Because in that it's not a perfect environment by any means, not even close to being perfect environment. But in that relatively stable environment, it's a better environment for Hong Kong to make use of the agency that it has, bring its autonomy into full play, organize its messaging, and decide what does it want to do as a super connector. You know, the chief executive last night spoke about Hong Kong as a super connector. Well, great, super connect. So please, you know, I had reopen that direct flight to Washington from Hong Kong, right? You probably lose money on it, Cathay, but please do it anyways. And figure out more opportunities for Hong Kongers to be traveling to the United States and speaking for themselves as Hong Kong, and communicate with America, whether it's New York or Hong Kong or Washington, and reach out and rebuild those bridges that are still there, but make them reinforced and even stronger, because I think that'll be good for the city, and it'll be good for US-China relations.
Thank you very much, Kurt, for your advice. The G2G engagement in the past few years has, of course, been damaged by the sanctions, you know. But I shouldn't say we've got used to the sanctions, but I think we've work our ways to continue to communicate, you know. And I certainly agree with you. It would be good for Hong Kong and good for US understanding of China and Hong Kong to have more engagement, G2G level, NGO to NGO level, and on other levels too, academic, cultural, and I hope that will happen. You know. So with these remarks, let me conclude our session, and thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Huang, and thank you, Kurt, for joining us.